for 712, we talked about Marxism. If you'll remember going back to the Industrial Revolution unit, Marxism falls under the umbrella of socialism. And the overall goal of socialism was to decrease the separation or the difference between the very, very rich and the very, very poor. Because remember, with the Industrial Revolution, people were making money. They're making cash money and buying stuff with it. But it also leads to a larger amount of very poor people who are doing those low-wage jobs. Some of the socialists we talked about were Saint-Simon, who said that you will give to those less fortunate out of Christian charity. Or there's Robert Owen, who built a nice place to live for his workers, created good conditions, built schools for them and for their children. So in that way, he's not necessarily giving the poor more money, but he's giving them a better quality of life. And he actually ended up with more effective workers that way, but he's still considered a socialist. Then we had Charles Fourier, who said, just do what you love and nobody will care about money. He talked about society being organized like fingers or phalanges and everyone working together like a hand. And then we had Marx, who his goal as a way to change the relationship between very rich and very poor was to have a violent overthrow of the proletariat, and that was the name he used for the poor, and they would overtake the bourgeoisie, or the rich, violently. It wouldn't be symbolically, it wouldn't be a political takeover, it would be a violent war, and that would completely change the relationship. And then the people, the proletariat, would become the government, and they would create or force equality throughout social classes. Now that's the theory. But most people, when they think Marxism, they think communism. That will eventually develop out of this, and there will be dictators. But the original goal was not to have a dictator; it was to have the people making the decisions, the people running the government. So the reason we're talking about this is we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution. Before we can talk about the revolt part, we have to go back to why it happened. This is Tsar Nicholas II. He is one of those many grandchildren of Queen Victoria. So his cousins are George V of England and Wilhelm II of Germany. When he becomes Tsar in 1894, he's a young guy. He's about 25 years old, and he has all of this power, and he's a very young 25. He's very immature. And he makes a lot of decisions thinking that it's good for his country, thinking it will bring prominence to his country when actually it's not always great. One example of that was the pogroms. This is when he starts essentially kicking Jews out of Russia. This is the topic of the musical Fiddler on the Roof, because he wants things to be more Russian. He wants to get the outsiders out of Russia. He was also Tsar during the Russo-Japanese War, which we talked about last unit. The Japanese won that war, you'll remember, because they modernized during the Meiji era. And when Russia loses, it starts a very small Russian Revolution in 1905. The people were upset. They could not believe that this great, well-known power, Russia, had just lost to little Japan. So the people are protesting, demanding changes, and the Duma is Tsar Nicholas's response. He creates the Duma as a representative body. He's saying, I'm giving the people representation. I'm listening to their opinions. However, the people who make up the Duma are really just nobility. Wealthy people, nobles, so they aren't really representative of the general population. Because if you remember the three things we always know about Russia, it's huge, it's cold, it's full of Russians. The majority of those Russians aren't noble and aren't wealthy. So this Duma, although his intent was very nice, Nicholas fails at this as well. Here is Nicholas's family. You perhaps have heard about his youngest daughter, Anastasia. He really cared about family life, and as a young ruler, inexperienced, focused on the niceties of life, Nicholas actually has quite a bit of denial about political life, about what's actually happening in his country. Part of it is that by this period, by 1914, 1915, the Russian citizens are not happy. The Duma was not enough. It did not change really much of anything. but Nicholas's mind, he gave them representation. That's what they wanted. Another issue that Nicholas has to deal with is his son's illness. You see Nicholas's son Alexei, you can see there sitting on the bottom in his sailor suit. Um, this is important because sons are very important to royal families. They carry on the family name. They succeed to the throne. And after having 4 girls, Nicholas was very happy to finally have a son. But Alexei was always very sick, very sickly as a child, and this comes from that intertwined family tree. When all of the families of Europe are related and then marry each other, and then they're doubly related and triply related, that creates lots of issues. In Alexei's case, he had hemophilia, which hopefully you learned about in biology class. Hemophilia is a blood disorder where oftentimes the blood does not clot. So you get a little cut on your arm, it doesn't stop bleeding. Where you and I, we would run into a wall and get a bruise, people with hemophilia might have internal bleeding. So Nicholas really doesn't admit to himself that this is a major issue. He tries to cover it up. He tries to explain that his son just needs more fresh air and exercise. It takes quite a while for Nicholas to finally say, okay, something is wrong with my son and something needs to be done about it. We need to be proactive about this. There weren't any doctors that could help, and so finally the royal family turns to Rasputin. Rasputin was he was an Orthodox monk, a little bit crazy. You can see his crazy eyes there, and he was this sort of wacky faith healer who said he could heal the crown prince. He can't, but he convinces the family, and he infiltrates his way into the family and sort of is able to sort of exert some influence over them. And then when that happens, that becomes the topic of rumors. The whole nation starts talking and gossiping about how Rasputin and the Tsarina are having an affair. Now, they weren't, but as we've seen, perception can be far more powerful than the truth. And Tsar Nicholas is not even admitting to himself that the rumor exists, let alone if there's any truth behind it. So he's just completely out of touch with the Russian people. By 1916, you have to consider the Russians have been engaged in war for 2 years almost. They are part of the Triple Entente, and they already were displeased with life at home. To add a war on top of that is not always the best idea, especially when the people who are already most unhappy are the ones who generally are the soldiers, they're the ones making up the army. Part of the reason is the economy is so terrible. Russia still has not modernized nearly to the extent that France or Germany or Britain or Japan even have by this point. So because of that lack of industry, Russia is stuck in the Dark Ages by 1916. This makes the economy even worse, especially during wartime. In winter of 1916, the people are fed up and they stop working. They strike. They protest. But it doesn't really, nothing really changes, so they give up. And finally, sort of the last straw leads to the March Revolution of 1917. This is sort of the Russian Revolution Part A, or the pre-revolution. People are really getting geared up. The women are a very important part of this revolution. In first week of March 1917, there are a number of women who are lined up to buy bread. Now, women generally are the ones who do the shopping, do the cooking, all of that. By this point, resources were very, very scarce. So these women have saved their money, they have lined up for hours, and there's no food for them to buy. So they're desperate, they're upset, they can't feed their children, and they start sort of protesting. They start marching through the streets, and they meet up with a group of women who are marching to commemorate International Women's Day. And these women are fighting for more political rights, suffrage and voting, and they want to end the war. So these two groups of women, the mothers and the protesters, they join forces and they start demanding bread and peace. We want a strong economy so that we can feed our families, and we don't want to fight a war where we have to send our sons away to die. So this sort of energy spreads throughout Russia, And the people, the citizens, are like, yeah, we've had enough, we're fed up. So they talk to the Duma. We want change. You're supposed to be our representatives. Now, the Duma are the nobles. They don't have any sense of what's really going on in the country, just like Nicholas. So they look to the Duma, and the Duma throws up their hands. They don't know what to do, and neither does Nicholas. Nicholas is at such a loss that he abdicates. He gives up his throne because he feels like he has no clue what to do. He has failed his people. So now he just becomes essentially a very wealthy, very fancy, regular citizen. Because he is no longer the Tsar, there must be a provisional or a temporary government until a new one can be decided upon. This is made up by essentially the Duma. So part of the problem becomes the solution. They make the decision to continue fighting in the war, because these are the noblemen. They're the ones who are running the war, but not really fighting in it individually. I mean, the Duma, the provisional government, is running things from these beautiful palaces in St. Petersburg. They get to sit around and drink tea and smoke cigars, and so they're very disconnected with the citizens. One thing that is seen as a positive move is they do allow for more religious freedom. So people who had been persecuted during the pogroms, they're now given more religious freedom. This does give the people a slightly better opinion of the Duma. So does this move. They free many, many political prisoners. During the time of the Tsar, if you said anything to criticize him, even to make fun of him, you could have been thrown in jail. You weren't a criminal, you didn't commit any act of crime, but just criticizing the government or the Tsar was enough to get you thrown in jail for life. So this provisional government, made up of the former Duma, they decide to start to let a lot of these prisoners go as an act of goodwill. So we're sort of one for two of positive things and negative things. So this provisional government, they've kept them in war, not really a good thing, but they've done two great things. But the problem is they're not really running anything. They're too relaxed. They're too used to their noble status and their high social system. So nothing really gets done. Chaos continues in the army, and you can watch this video clip, these two video clips from Dr. Zhivago, if you're in Canada, so over on the right, and it shows what the intent was when this war started. There are people who are going to be able to use this war and use the discontent of the soldiers and civilians to get their desires changed, or to get their political ideas enacted. Many of those ideas will come together in the Petrograd Soviet. This is created as an alternative government. It is the anti-Duma. It is an alternative from the provisional government. So we have a group setting up a second government in Russia. And this government wants to represent Russians. It wants to represent the proletariat, the average citizen. Like any government, they start building the things they need to take power. They start building up an army. And many of the people in the army are called Bolsheviks. These are the more extreme people in the party, just like any political party, of people who are a little wackier in their ideas. So the Bolsheviks, they are the name for the people in the Petrograd Soviet who are more extreme and wanting to get rid of this noble, expensive way of life in Russia. Another thing, the Petrograd Soviet. Petrograd is the more Russianized name of Petersburg. St. Petersburg, you'll remember from Peter the Great, was created to be closer to Western Europe, to be more like the West. Now, during this time, we have this surging of Slavophilism, a love of Russia, a love of Russianness. So we start to have these names reminding them of Russian culture, not of the West. The West brought in this wealth and many of the problems that the Russian citizens don't like. So the Petrograd Soviet is sort of functioning at the same time as the provisional government, as the sort of Duma-led government. Some of those political prisoners who have been released from prison will be very, very important. One of them is this man. This is V.I. Lenin, or Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and he had studied the works of Marx. He borrows the phrase from the women in the March Revolution who want peace and bread, and he adds to it land. He says the people must control the land. The people must have the means of production, is what Marx would say. And so Lenin becomes very popular amongst the people, amongst the workers, amongst the peasants, because he's saying that he wants to give them power. So we're starting to see that Marxist attitude that the rich will be violently overtaken by the poor. So the November Revolution, or it's also called the October Revolution sometimes because Russia was working on a different calendar at the time, also known as the Red Revolution. The color red is important. Red is the color that the Bolsheviks choose to represent them. When anyone refers to the Russian Revolution, they are mostly referring to this November/October Revolution. They are led by Lenin and his friend Trotsky, another of these political prisoners who had recently been freed. So the Red Guards, these are the Bolshevik soldiers, they decide to surround the Winter Palace. Now, the royal family was so wealthy that they had multiple palaces. They would live in one in winter and one in summer and multiple in spring and fall. So the Bolsheviks, these Marxist-inspired alternative government, they want to get rid of the royalty. Even though Nicholas has stepped down, even though he has abdicated, they still are the symbol. So the Bolsheviks want to violently take over the government. They will be fighting a group that will become known as the Whites. These are the people who want to maintain the Tsar, who want to maintain social order. They don't want this violent overthrow. And this will lead to a number of years of civil war. The civil war will last almost 5 years between the Whites and the Reds. So we have to talk about Nicholas again. He abdicates in early 1917 because he doesn't know what to do. But the Bolsheviks are now afraid of this former czar who's just hanging out, living in his country house, not bothering anybody. He chops wood for a hobby. The Bolsheviks are afraid of the symbolism of the czar. They're afraid that the Duma, or the Whites, or the people who support that old-fashioned, unequal system, will try and make Nicholas czar again. So they place Nicholas and his family, the Romanov family, under house arrest. In this way, they're making sure that no one can kidnap the Romanovs or try and reinstate Nicholas. Their life as a family is getting further and further away from the wealth and luxury that they were so used to. But the Bolsheviks are paranoid. They don't want anything to threaten their takeover, their violent overthrow of the Russian system. Here we can see the daughters. That's a very different picture from their family portrait when they're dripping in gowns and jewels. They just look like regular people. But this isn't good enough. And so in July 1918, the family is killed by a firing squad. And there's a clip to show you that. And from the perspective of King George V. Remember, not only were these two countries, Russia and Britain, allies, but they were family. And so that complicates things, because these leaders sometimes will have to decide to make decisions based on politics or based on family ties. Once the Petrograd Soviet, once the Bolsheviks take more and more power, they're still fighting a civil war, but they'll have more power. They decide they do not want to be at war with Germany. They do not want Russian soldiers fighting Germany, because the war was seen as originally a war between the bourgeoisie, the wealthy members of each country. So they sign a separate peace agreement. This is called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and this is March of 1918. So Russia wants to end the war separately with Germany. They are leaving the Triple Entente, and whenever anyone surrenders, whenever a country says, okay, we give up, that country usually has to give up some things. One element of this treaty is Germany now says, okay, that's great. There's a bunch of groups, there's a bunch of ethnic groups living in this Russian territory, and you're trying to make them Russian. Don't. Let them be independent. Another issue is Russia has to give up lots of its land. First thing we know of Russia is really, really big. So they give up almost a quarter of their territory. They have lots to give up, but this will be a problem. That land is very important for agriculture, for rebuilding the Russian economy. So this will prove to be an issue at the start of the new Russian government, or the Soviet government. And lastly, the capital city had been St. Petersburg since the 1700s when Peter the Great builds it there. Now, after giving up this land, the borders have changed, and St. Petersburg is very close to now enemy territory. So they move away from that western, newly built capital to the ancient city of Moscow. It's further inland, and they feel it is more Russian. We will talk more next unit about the Soviet government and how that develops after this revolution.